Buenos días a todos y a todas. Me escucháis bien, ¿verdad? Bueno, pues muy bienvenidos al Máster Universitario en Interpretación de los Negocios, en Interpretación de Conferencias Orientado a los Negocios. Hoy empezamos la ceremonia de inauguración, aunque ya lleváis un mes de clase online síncrona. También nos hemos visto algunos de forma presencial en la Biblioteca Nacional en una jornada especial. Y bueno, hasta ahora todo ha ido muy bien y bueno, estamos muy satisfechos con cómo ha ido el curso. Yo voy a hacer una pequeña presentación. En la mesa me acompañan nuestra conferenciante invitada, que es Elizabeth Tiselius, me acompañan la profesora Carmen Valero, la directora del departamento Raquel Lázaro, y está aquí también Elena Alcalde, que es la directora del máster, que ahora veréis que pues está en una situación especial y bueno, ha preferido estar más tranquila en la segunda fila, pero bueno, ella es la directora del máster, yo soy la codirectora y trabajamos muy estrechamente. Bueno, y por supuesto a Silvia ya la conocéis todos, es con la que más contacto tenéis. Y también le doy las gracias por toda la labor que realiza. Bueno, pues ya sabéis quiénes somos. Recordar quiénes son los coordinadores. El coordinador de inglés, los coordinadores son Juan Luis Cobano y Gabriel Cabrera. Tenéis aquí sus correos. Y en el caso de chino, la coordinadora es Yizang. Ya habéis tenido contacto con ellos. Silvia ya la acabamos de presentar. Entonces, cualquier duda que tengáis con esas asignaturas, lo mejor es que se lo planteéis a ellos, ¿de acuerdo? Bueno, este es el programa académico, tal y como está organizado. Consta de 6 módulos. El primero ya lo hemos terminado, lo que es el módulo online, que es un módulo más teórico, donde sentamos las bases de lo que vais a desarrollar a continuación. A partir de hoy y hasta el 16 de febrero viene el grueso del módulo, que son las asignaturas de toma de notas, de interpretación consecutiva y bilateral, interpretación simultánea, que sé que estáis deseando que llegue ese momento. Después vienen las optativas desde el 17 de febrero al 14 de marzo. A continuación, el módulo de prácticas de marzo a junio y finalmente el trabajo de fin de máster, que se hace en junio y en algunos casos en septiembre. Esperemos que la mayoría de vosotros llegue a tiempo y lo pueda hacer en junio. Nosotros lo recomendamos. Para ello hay que ponerse con antelación, hay que ponerse con tiempo. Bueno, en este primer módulo online que acabamos de ver, pues hemos visto 3 asignaturas. No lo voy a repetir porque ya las habéis visto, ya habéis hecho todas las prácticas. Sabéis que todavía estamos terminando de revisar, de corregir, pero a lo largo de esta semana ya tendréis las calificaciones y como muy tarde, sino a la siguiente. Este módulo ya lo hemos completado. En el siguiente módulo, que dura 4 meses, pues tenéis estas asignaturas, tanto en inglés como en chino, toma de notas y recursos para la interpretación, consecutiva y bilateral, simultánea, tanto en español-chino como en español-inglés. Y tenéis además 2 asignaturas comunes que van en una franja horaria, que es la franja horaria central, que es Economía y Negocios, Instituciones Europeas y Organizaciones Internacionales. Estas asignaturas las imparten catedráticos y profesores de la Facultad de Económicas y Ciencias Empresariales. Son personas muy especializadas en este campo y de ahí el nombre de nuestro máster, porque tenéis este complemento, ¿no?, de teórico de Economía y Negocios y de Instituciones Europeas. En cuanto al horario, bueno, pues ya sabéis que para el grupo de chino el horario es de mañana, de 9 a 1, y para el grupo de inglés es por la tarde, y de 1 a 3 tenéis estas 2 asignaturas comunes. No sé si algunos conocéis las instalaciones, pero bueno, las clases se imparten todas en el edificio San José de Caracholos, que es un antiguo convento maravilloso, con unos claustros preciosos, donde vais a sentir mucha paz y vais a sentir muchas ganas de estudiar, porque el edificio lo proporciona ese ambiente, ¿no? Y nuestras instalaciones están en la planta baja. Ahí está la secretaría, donde está Silvia. Tenéis el aula 10, donde vais a dar las clases de consecutiva y bilateral. Tiene una pantalla inteligente chulísima, y al lado tenéis las cabinas de interpretación, 12 cabinas con 2 puestos cada uno, también con accesibilidad, con el software LabTrack, que es el software más moderno que hay en estos momentos y que, bueno, cuando las veáis vais a ver lo nuevas que están, lo bonitas que son, y sí que os pedimos, aunque quizás sobra decirlo, pero bueno, os pedimos tratarlas con mucho mimo, como si fueran vuestras mascotas. Bien, en los módulos 3 y 4, que son las asignaturas optativas, pues tenéis 2 asignaturas en chino, tendríais interpretación consecutiva y bilateral inglés-español, o interpretación consecutiva y bilateral español-inglés, mientras que en inglés tenéis la posibilidad de hacer interpretación simultánea español-francés e interpretación consecutiva y bilateral español-francés. En cuanto a las prácticas, pues normalmente, aunque no siempre es así, pero normalmente se hacen desde marzo hasta mayo, e incluso también se pueden hacer hasta septiembre, porque hay personas que las empiezan más tarde o incluso que se han ido en verano a hacerlas en el extranjero. Es importante que asistáis a una sesión que vamos a hacer el día 13 de diciembre, a las 10 va a ser una sesión presencial donde os vamos a hablar de todo el funcionamiento, os lo va a explicar Silvia muy bien, el funcionamiento de las prácticas, y ese día también os vamos a hablar de cómo debéis de trabajar en el trabajo de fin de máster, que es muy importante empezar a tiempo para llegar a tiempo también. Todas las prácticas se gestionan a través de una plataforma que llamamos GIPE. Ahí dentro subiréis la memoria, se sube también la evaluación del tutor académico, la evaluación del tutor de prácticas, etcétera, ¿vale? Bien. En cuanto al trabajo de fin de máster, pues ya es un trabajo obligatorio, hay que hacerlo. En nuestro caso es un trabajo eminentemente práctico, muy orientado a lo que vais a hacer en el futuro, y por eso os pedimos que hagáis un encargo real de interpretación sobre un tema muy determinado y que elaboréis un glosario específico de términos en las lenguas que manejáis. Y a continuación, una vez realizado este trabajo, se hace una defensa oral ante un tribunal compuesto por 3 profesores, ¿de acuerdo? Tenéis 2 convocatorias, la ordinaria, que es hasta el 20 de junio, y la extraordinaria hasta el 19 de septiembre, pero hay que tener en cuenta que el mes de agosto es un mes inhábil en la universidad, estamos cerrados, no trabajamos, entonces de facto significa tener más o menos todo terminado en julio si uno quiere ir a la convocatoria de septiembre. Bien, también tenemos algo en este máster que consideramos muy especial, que fue algo que lanzó la profesora Carmen Valero desde que empezamos con el máster, que son los coloquios. Los coloquios son seminarios que pueden ser presenciales o pueden ser online. Algunos ya los habéis tenido con Marta Ruiz de la Unión Europea, con Josh Goldsmith, y bueno, la conferencia que vamos a tener hoy también lo podemos considerar un coloquio. A través de estos seminarios lo que pretendemos es que ampliéis o afiancéis conocimientos que ya habéis obtenido, que profundicéis en ellos y sobre todo que estéis en contacto estrecho con la profesión, que sepáis qué es lo que se está moviendo en torno a la interpretación, que ahora tiene mucho que ver con la tecnología. Y bueno, también intentamos proporcionaros herramientas que hagan el trabajo del intérprete más ameno y más fácil de gestionar con todas las tecnologías que existen ahora, pero que al mismo tiempo nos pueden abrumar. Por eso es importante saber escoger cuáles son las adecuadas y cómo aplicarlas. Aquí tenemos un calendario de todos los coloquios de este curso. Ya hemos tenido, fijaros, ya estamos en el 4 de noviembre, o sea que hemos tenido ya, con hoy ya van a ser 5 de los coloquios y quedaría pendiente el del día 7 de noviembre, donde vais a aprender a manejar la herramienta Sketch Engine con la profesora María del Mar Sánchez Ramos, y el coloquio del 13 de diciembre que haremos Silvia y yo sobre las prácticas y el TFM, que es un coloquio más práctico, más académico, pero bueno, os va a servir mucho, yo creo. Bien, luego otras actividades que organizamos también. Este máster nace al abrigo del grupo de investigación FITISPOS que coordina la profesora Carmen Valero, y este grupo organiza numerosas actividades relacionadas con la traducción e interpretación, y tenéis aquí hoy a las 4 esta actividad de la Semana de la Ciencia que se llama Global e-Party in PSIT. ¿Cuánto sabes sobre la TISP? Esto está orientado a la traducción e interpretación de los servicios públicos, que no es exactamente el foco de interés de nuestro máster, pero está relacionado y puede ser de interés para vosotros. Y tenéis también hoy a las 6 otra actividad súper interesante, que es una mesa redonda titulada Construyendo sociedades más inclusivas, universidad y mujeres migrantes cualificadas, también online. Estáis invitadísimos a asistir a estas dos actividades. En cuanto a los horarios de información para consultas, pues ya sabéis que este es el correo electrónico, este es el teléfono del máster. El horario presencial, si queréis venir a alguna consulta, porque os gusta más que hacerlo por correo electrónico, es los lunes y miércoles de 10 a 5 en el Colegio de San José de Caracholos, ese convento tan bonito que os he comentado, y está en la planta baja. Era la antigua biblioteca, por eso tiene unos techos muy altos, donde se respira muy bien, la verdad. Y bueno, pues allí vais a estar a partir de hoy. Y nada más, esta es mi introducción y ahora ya le cedo la palabra a la profesora Carmen Valero, que va a presentar a nuestra invitada especial, Elizabeth Tiselius. Así que, Carmen, cuando quieras.
Gracias, Ingrid. Bienvenidos todos y, sobre todo, bienvenida a nuestra querida ponente, Elizabeth Tiselius. Hoy es un placer, la verdad, presentarla a ella y también ver vuestras caras, ¿no? Porque después de más o menos online, yo no os he seguido mucho, pero sí que estabais ahí y yo también estaba detrás. Entonces, para que sepáis que siempre, aunque no nos veáis, como bien dice la subdirectora Ingrid, siempre estamos ahí, o sea, los correos y los teléfonos funcionan, o sea, que podéis perfectamente contactar con nosotros. Pero hoy, para inaugurar esto y como muestra de lo que a lo mejor algún día llegáis a ser, no sé, quizá voy a presentar en español. Ella no habla español, o sea que, lo siento, Elizabeth, I'm talking in Spanish. ¿Es okay? Entonces, bueno, Elizabeth Tiselius viene de la Universidad de Estocolmo. Ella es intérprete profesional. Esta también es miembro, que si no suena, os sonará muy pronto, de la Asociación Internacional de Intérpretes de Conferencias, AIC. Está también acreditada por la Unión Europea, que tiene también la SKIC o la Dirección General de Interpretación, que luego hablaremos de ella y que os interesa, ¿no? Empezar ahí. Ya la conocéis, sin duda, ya a través del módulo online, es algo que ya que lo tenéis en mente. Y Elizabeth, como os digo, tiene una labor, es una gran investigadora, le interesa sobre todo los procesos de cognición, de la práctica, pero ha trabajado en diferentes ámbitos, no solamente en los negocios, por supuesto, porque le toca, pero también en otros ámbitos más específicos. Por ejemplo, también investigando, ¿no?, lo que son los procesos de cognición, pero en lengua de signos. Ha trabajado también con niños, o sea, cómo elaboran, cómo funciona, digamos, nuestra mente. O sea, es interesante saber cómo funciona nuestra mente para agilizar los procesos. Realmente ella es experta en ello y es donde va un poco a insistir. Es también, bueno, sus lenguas de trabajo son el inglés, el francés, el danés y el sueco. ¿Ya? ¿Es okay? Okay. Tiene proyectos, ha trabajado, bueno, dirige un grupo de investigación que se llama Sprint y también ahora mismo está trabajando en un proyecto de PIC, que es sobre lengua de signos. Hay que decir también que es la presidenta de la asociación, que es la Asociación Europea de Estudios de Traducción, o EST, y también es la vicepresidenta de la Asociación Internacional de Intérpretes de Conferencias, que se llama EMCI. Y ello realmente es interesante, ¿no? O sea, que tenéis aquí a una persona realmente influyente y muy conocedora sobre todo de la investigación, porque parte de vuestro trabajo no va a ser solamente estudiar, digamos, también vais a tener que investigar, y de hecho investigáis, para prepararos ya solamente los trabajos, los discursos. Entonces, creo que es un perfil muy adecuado para que hoy os impulse hacia adelante, y tenéis a una persona realmente es investigadora, es intérprete y es profesora. O sea, reúne los tres elementos fundamentales para poder avanzar. Yo no quiero robarle más tiempo, así es que aquí tenéis Elizabeth Tiselius en vuestras manos. Gracias, Elizabeth, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm happy to hear that I'm influential. We'll see if what you think after this presentation. I think I now have until 1:30. Is that right? Yeah. So this is quite a theoretical presentation, so I'm going to go slowly, and I also think that we can take a break in the middle so that you can rest your brain a little. First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I think it was exactly a year ago, right? Mm-hmm. I really like coming back to Alcalá. I think you are at a wonderful university and also a great opportunity with the new program. Business interpreting is indeed something where interpreters are lacking and where you can make a difference. So I think it's a really good initiative. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you for listening to me. And I'll try to house. If you have Spanish, you work into English, right? But if you have Chinese, you work Chinese, Spanish. So how's your English? It's okay? Yeah? Good. Fine. You stop me if I'm speaking too fast or being too theoretical or incomprehensible. Okay. So we'll start with this eternal question. What is interpreting? Can you offer me any suggestions for what interpreting is, as opposed to translation, or as opposed to just speaking two languages? Or maybe you already cheated and got the definition that I'm going to give. No? What do you do when you interpret?
We have volunteer over there.
So listen a language.
Yeah?
A second language, for example, and speaking
Yeah.
language.
Yeah. Or vice versa. So you listen to a message in one language and you translate, you utter it in the other language, which is often your mother tongue, but you can also do vice versa, right? So, and especially when you're doing dialogue or business or retour interpreting, as we say in simultaneous, then you work into the other language. So are you familiar with the Austrian interpreter researcher Franz Pöchacke? He has a book which is called Introducing Interpreting Studies. It might show up in on your reading list. If not, I can recommend it. It is on your reading list. Good. So he starts off with saying that interpreting is a form of translation in which a first and final rendition in another language is produced on the basis of a one-time presentation of an utterance in a source language. This was his teacher in Heidelberg, I think, Otto Kade, who used this definition for translation, but what Pöchacke did, he added the one-time presentation, which is characteristic of interpreting, of course, that it's a spoken word, and once it's uttered, it's gone. You can, of course, ask for repetition if you're not in simultaneous, but once we cannot say we can say the same word once again, but if we repeat the utterance, it will be slightly different. I think you agree with me on that, right? And so I like this presentation, but the problem with it, I think, is that it focuses only on what the interpreter does. And interpreting is also so very contextual, right? So it depends on in which context you interpret. The simultaneous interpreter in the booth is very different from the healthcare interpreter in the middle of treatment. And I think we have to look at the whole interpreted context in order to offer a definition, which means that the definition will be slightly different depending on what type of interpreting we're talking about, right? So this has led me, and I should say that what I'm going to talk about now is a research project, several actually, and I'm not doing this alone. So what I'm talking about a lot today is what I've done with my colleague, Laura Babcock at Stockholm University. She is a researcher in bilingualism to start with and has come into interpreting from the bilingual perspective. And we have talked about how you use your languages depending on which type of interpreting you're doing. And we suggest that interpreting is not one thing. I think this is not new to you, right? It's quite obvious. We talk about, and now I would like to take you not to the professions of interpreting, but to the techniques of interpreting, right? So depending on which technique you do or you learn or you refine as you're working, it's different. And we have divided it into simultaneous interpreting, consecutive interpreting, dialogue interpreting, and sign language interpreting. And simultaneous, consecutive, and dialogue interpreting is, of course, between two spoken languages. And sign language interpreting can be either between a spoken and a signed language, or between two signed languages. You agree with me on that? And I guess by now you should know that sign language, that every country and sometimes even every region has their own sign language. Yes, okay. We also differ between consecutive interpreting and dialogue interpreting. And we say that consecutive interpreting is what you do when you do the long with notes, a long monologue with notes. Dialogue interpreting is, of course, also consecutive, but you interpret in a dialogue, so you go back and forth much more than the monologue note-taking consecutive interpreter. In case you doubted which was what, I also added some pictures. This is from the European Parliament, I think. If you do not know what happened to the poor Marina Gross, which is the name of the interpreter in that picture, you should go and research it on the internet. It was a big thing when she was the only interpreter in a meeting between Donald Trump and Putin, and they wanted to have her notes. And it became the discussion about the interpreter's notes, whether you could read something from that or not, was a big discussion. So a very interesting case. Dialogue interpreting, in a dialogue between a patient or a police officer, or, a doctor and a patient, a police officer and an interviewee, a lawyer and his client, or any situation where an individual person meets a public servant of some sort. And then sign language interpreting. And I love this picture because it really tells you something about the complexity of sign language interpreting. I know it's a little bit dark, so it's difficult to see. But what you see are sign language interpreters in the European Parliament who stand in front of their delegate to sign for them. And some of them, this is really impossible to see because it's too dark, but some of them also have headphones, so listening to the interpretation into, let's say, spoken Hungarian, and then sign language interpreting into Hungarian Sign Language. It's also nice because often, in many cases, like today when we become more and more a square on the screen, it's nice to see them in the hall with their clients. Often they are only on an iPad. They sit also in a booth, in another neighboring booth, and they are on the iPad in front of their clients. And I think we also agreed that simultaneous interpreting is not, the interpreting mode is not the same as the interpreter. And we could talk about, there are other professions, of course, but we can talk about public service interpreters, business interpreters, conference interpreters, and sign language interpreters. And they all use the different modes in different ways. So we could say that the conference interpreter mostly works in a booth, but also masters the long consecutive interpreting. The dialogue, the public service and business interpreter uses a lot of dialogue interpreting because you work at meetings. But the public service and the business interpreter also use simultaneous because in these types of professions you whisper a lot, even if you don't go into the booth, right? But you have a lot of meetings with either whispered interpreting or where you use the famous bidule. Have you heard of the bidule? That's the little guide case that you can bring to your meeting. In French they call it bidule. It's just, a thingy is the word in French, and they called it that because they hated it so much, because it was quite heavy in the beginning of the interpreter history, and they had to carry it to their different meetings. So definitely simultaneous interpreting as well. The sign language interpreting is interesting because the sign language interpreter will always go into simultaneous because they work in two modes, right? So they don't have to think about the auditory sort of disturbance that the other language is, but they interpret dialogues in simultaneous and also conferences in simultaneous. And obviously it's very different to interpret in a doctor's office in a dialogue, even if you interpret in simultaneous in sign language interpreting, compared to what I showed at the European Parliament. But they still do it in simultaneous. So other things define their practice there. Okay so far? Yeah? So, the fundamentals of simultaneous interpreting. And now I'm thinking of fundamentals in terms of what am I interested in as a researcher. If I want to research simultaneous interpreting, how does it differ from the other types of interpreting? Why do I think that this is different and that it requires some other methods or approaches to research? Well, first of all, the interpreter's utterances, so what the interpreter produces is simultaneous rendition of a monologue, usually, because somebody gives a speech and the interpreter is in the booth and renders the speech. So it's a monologue or it's a rather long utterance into the other language. There's very little interaction between the speaker, even if you can interpret simultaneously a change of opinions, of course. The speakers in simultaneous conference interpreting is typically, they are prepared. They think of parliaments or conferences or questions in a scientific conference. So it's not like interpreting a dialogue or a Q&A or an informal gathering of some sort. So therefore, they don't have to handle a lot of the interaction. And also, the interpreter has a relative distance to the speaker. When I say that, I often get contradictions because they say that simultaneous interpreters can be very close to their speakers. For instance, if you're whispering a whole conference or you're standing behind your speaker and you're very close to them. And with distance, I mean more that if I work as a simultaneous conference interpreter, I don't have very much knowledge about the private life of my client. Whereas if I work as a dialogue interpreter, at least the client who is the individual, not the civil servant, but the individual seeking help, I will know a lot about their private life probably, and even to the point where they will try to use me as a vehicle of getting, what they want or a better treatment or anything. So there's a much more intimate relationship, let's say, between the interpreter and the client in dialogue interpreting. Also, the interpreter in simultaneous only works into one language at a time. Many interpreters, of course, do a retour and work into the other language, but you don't have to think about changing languages all the time. You work into one language, which makes it easier to suppress the other language. So interpreting is interesting because your two languages have to be active. I will come back to that. But your two languages have to be active, but one language is suppressed to a greater or bigger extent because you only produce one language at a time. And if you do it in simultaneous, you produce only that language for quite a long time. So the suppression is easier. You don't have to think about which language was I using now, okay? And you follow the speaker with very little lag. That means that you can offload cognitively. You don't have to remember. You have to understand what you're saying, supposedly, but you don't have to remember what you're saying. It's offloaded, it's gone. It's like the spoken word. Once uttered, it doesn't come back, okay? And you monitor your output. You have to monitor what you say, that it links to what was said, but you don't have to monitor what the others say or think, or if they want a word or something, you just produce your own output and make sure that, in your opinion, this is what was said in the other language, in the language you interpret from. For consecutive interpreting, I would say that it's basically the same, that there's a consecutive rendition of a monologue, that there is a relative distance to the speaker, but of course in consecutive interpreting you're close to your speaker all the time. Maybe not as close to as in dialogue, but you will stand beside your speaker, you might be on the stage, or you are seen with the speaker, like we saw Marina Gross in the meeting with Trump and Putin. But the same thing as for simultaneous, you only work into one language at a time. You don't have to think about the change of languages, or not as often at least. You take your notes, and once your notes are taken, you work into that other language. But you take notes for a vast amount of time in consecutive interpreting. So this will be a toll on your memory and your cognitive resources. You have to know how to take notes, you have to take notes for a long time, and when you render your interpreting, you're very dependent on what you noted, right? But again, what you monitor is your own output. You don't have to monitor the other speakers. They take care of themselves, but you make sure that what you say is in according to what you think you heard. For dialogue interpreting, it's the short type of consecutive interpreting, so you interpret utterance by utterance, which doesn't mean that there is it doesn't mean that there's a limit to what an utterance is, right? So if you're interpreting a dialogue, an utterance can be very short or very long. And also, when you're interpreting in a dialogue, you are sort of responsible for when to step in and interpret. Because if you let it go for too long, you risk forgetting, because you can't take the same notes in a dialogue. But if it's too short, you interrupt your speaker. So your knowledge of the turn taking is much more important. Do you know what turn taking is? So a turn is when the speaker has sole access to the floor. So right now I have a very, very long monologue turn. Nobody will interrupt me because you know I'm supposed to speak until I say that I'm done or ask you questions. But in a dialogue with friends, for instance, we speak all the time and we know when to jump into the conversation. So every time it's my turn to speak, that is my turn. The turn taking is when I give my turn or the turn is taken from me. So think about when you talk among friends. If you ask a question, it's easy, because when somebody hears that you ask a question and maybe you look at them, then you will know that, oh, it's my turn. I was asked a question. I have to do something now. I'm expected to respond to this. If I make a statement, anybody can jump in when I finish. In languages like Spanish, people tend to jump in before, because it's not supposed to be silent between the speakers, right? I don't know about Chinese, but in Swedish we stop and then we wait and then the next person starts. And when we have this stop, that's when it might be a bit ambiguous who is going to take the turn next time, and that might be decided by who am I looking at, or what was the topic, or who has the knowledge of answering this. And for languages like Spanish, you know when to jump in, so as there's no silence in between the speakers, right? This is very intuitive. We know it. But when we do it in dialogue interpreting, we have to learn how to handle it as well. Because the thing with dialogue interpreting is that if you know how to handle the turn, you also, we call it, sorry, I forgot one important word, a turn relevance point is what we as speakers know intuitively that this is a good time for me to start speaking. It differs from language to language, but because we grew up in languages, we know when it's relevant for me to take the turn. So turn relevance point. But in dialogue interpreting, we have to figure out what's the interpreting relevance point. So when is it a good time for me to take the turn to interpret? It might be that I have to stop my speaker and say, sorry, I have to interpret too long, too much. But it may also be that it's enough for me to turn to the speaker and to sound as if I was going to start speaking, like, and they will immediately stop. Because we know this intuitively. So if we can work them as an interpreter, we have a strong tool to handle the turns. And it's also important for us, because otherwise, again, in dialogue interpreting, if we can't take notes, so if the turns are too long, we forget. Another thing that is very particular to dialogue interpreting is that the renditions of the target text, that the renditions are a target text of a preceding utterance. So just as for simultaneous interpreting, somebody says something and I say it in my other language. What's different here is that what I say in the other language will immediately be the source text of the next utterance. So depending on my interpreting, there can be different choices for the other speaker. So compared to simultaneous interpreting, I interpret, I interpret, I interpret. The speaker knows what they're going to say because they have a manuscript. But in my dialogue interpreting, the speaker who's going to respond will only know what to respond depending on what I said. So my utterance becomes more important in dialogue interpreting because that is what the speaker is going to react to. Okay? We agree on that? Of course, there are two or more participants in one conversation. And also simultaneous elements may occur. In sign language interpreting, they always occur. But if you're interpreting a dialogue and suddenly, for some reason, one speaker starts with a very long explanation, you may choose to start whispering during that segment because it's a very long segment and it makes more sense that I whisper that. So I may go into simultaneous in the dialogue and work between the two modes, but never for a long time, of course. So in the dialogue, I work as an interpreter. I work in two directions all the time, which means that the possibility for me to suppress the other language is much less possible, which means that I may have things coming out, as you may or may not have experienced, that I think that I speak in Spanish, let's say, but in fact I still continue to speak in English. So people will have to stop me and say, you're speaking English now, you're supposed to speak Spanish. That's a very common mistake when you're a tired dialogue interpreter, because the suppression is much more important in dialogue interpreting. You have to know when to suppress which language. And the monitoring, you have to monitor you just don't monitor your own output and your own understanding. You also have to monitor what the other people are doing and saying. Because you monitor if they want to have the word, you will see that because they start turning, they start looking, or they even make signs. You have to monitor that they understood. So if you have interpreted, you finished your turn, you listen to what the other speaker responds, and you realize that, no, they misunderstood what you said. So you can't, at no point you can say, okay, I'll take a break now. When I turn off the mic as a simultaneous interpreter, I can say, good, I'm done. I might have worked for a longer time, but I'm done. I don't have to care about what the others say. Ideally, my colleague takes over, but there may also be, I just have a break, right? In dialogue interpreting, while there is a conversation, you don't have that break. You have to monitor the other participants all the time, because otherwise you don't enable this communication that we do in dialogue interpreting. And of course, you ensure that they comprehend each other. If they don't understand each other, you try to accommodate. Clearly, you don't say, I think you misunderstood, or in most cases at least, you don't interrupt and say, I think you misunderstood, because people may want to misunderstand as well. And it's not your responsibility as an interpreter to tell them what to do, right? But from your interpreting perspective, you make sure that there wasn't a possibility to misunderstand, okay? Yeah, I said that we have to handle the turn-taking of all participants because we're sort of, and this has been shown by researchers in conversation analysis. So conversation analysis is when you have a recorded material and you sit down and you look at how the different people in a conversation take the word and what they do, and you really look at it on a micro level so as to understand exactly what happens when somebody takes the turn or gives the turn, or what happens when they stress a specific word. And they have seen that the interpreter, although we may seem as we don't steer the conversation, in fact the interpreter steers the conversation quite a lot, because with silent or little signals, but with the purpose, of course, to be able to interpret. And often in dialogue interpreting, when you work in simultaneous interpreting, I shouldn't say always, but often you work into very strong languages. So I'm sure you're aware of the ABC languages that we label in conference interpreting, yeah? So we would say that if you work in simultaneous, you only work into your A or your B language. And your A language obviously being your mother tongue or equivalent, and your B language being an extremely strong language that you speak fluently without almost any accent, etc. So in theory, when you work, you always work into languages that you're very comfortable working in. In dialogue interpreting, in many situations, the asymmetry between the two languages are much bigger, because you may not be able to work into your A and B language. As business interpreters, for instance, it will be A-B languages, so you have an advantage already there. But as public service interpreters, you may arrive in the country as an adult, learn the country's language as an adult, you work into that language, you may learn that language very well, but it would not be labeled from a conference interpreting perspective a B language. So there's a bigger asymmetry between the two languages, and you have to handle that. Most people handle that beautifully, but it takes cognitive resources to do that. And finally, sign language interpreting. So it's the same. Oh, it's jumping around a little bit. So the strong characteristics, as I've already said, about sign language interpreting is that you work into two different modalities. You always work in simultaneous mode, regardless of the context. In many situations, just as for dialogue interpreting the renditions are the ones that the people base their next utterance on. So you have more responsibility, so to say, over the utterance. And in case of the interpreter, it's the same as for dialogue interpreting. They often monitor the other participants' contribution to the dialogue. They ensure comprehension. They ensure comprehension even more than in dialogue interpreting, because in sign language interpreting, the deaf person and the interpreter often clears what is being said. They can, while you're interpreting to them, say, oh, stop, I didn't understand, what did you say there? And the interpreter, while listening to what the hearing person says, has to clarify for the deaf person what was said. Oh, I meant this. And the same thing goes for the interpreter. The interpreter can say suddenly, so he's saying this word and finger spelling it. I'm not sure which sign you would like to use. The deaf person will say, oh, I used this sign for that. And then they continue with that sign. So there is a lot more of feedback going on between the deaf person and the sign language interpreter. And also if the sign language interpreter works in pairs, there's a lot of feedback going on between the two sign language interpreters, much more so than if you work in a booth with a colleague. And handles the turn taking. They also deal with asymmetrical language knowledge, much more so than in spoken language, because a majority of sign language interpreters learn sign language when they start learning how to interpret from sign language. So you decide at the university that you want to be a sign language interpreter, and that's when you start learning the sign language. There are, of course, CODAs, children of deaf adults, which grew up with sign language and have sign language as the first language, but clearly not all of them want to become interpreters. So therefore, there's a lack of interpreters who are more or less bilingual with sign language, and therefore you learn sign language at university, and therefore you are, as you can, it's just as for any language, the later you learn a language, obviously the longer it takes, the more asymmetrical your languages are. So, we're back to that interpreting is not one thing. And here I come to, now we're sort of leaving the more practical side of it, and I'm going into the more theoretical side. So I must ask you now, how much do you know about cognition? Have you heard it before, the cognitive processes of interpreting, or read it before in your literature? Yeah? How do you feel about it? So what we talk about in interpreting, and especially so I'll restart. Interpreting in many ways is a social process, because it's a process between people. So what we do and how we interpret, and our next decision as interpreters, is based on the social network between people. But in order to perform the social processes, we need our brain to do it. And those are the cognitive processes of interpreting. And this is everything from monitoring what we will be saying next, knowing our two languages, knowing note-taking, having background skills. I have a list of all this a little bit further down the presentation. But all this is part of our cognition. And cognition, in many cases, it can be automatized, so we don't know what we do. We still do it, but in many cases, it's also conscious. So it's something that we learned. And it can be compared to, like, we don't have to think about that we breathe or that our heart beats. That's really the I never remember what that what that neural system is called, but that's the automatic neural system, right? We have learned how to walk and how to run, but that's something that is completely automatized. We never have to think about it. Interpreting is something which is not automatized in that way. It's a very conscious process of learning it. We are very aware of our cognitive processes while we're learning it, because it's very difficult to learn, and we have to really work on and master the different skills needed. But at one point, hopefully, it's more or less automatized, so we can think about other things in our interpreting. And when we as researchers talk about the cognitive load, this is interesting for us, because we want to know the cognitive load we always handle. The cognitive load is what is put upon us when we do a task. But the cognitive load can be low, because we know the task, because we know the languages, because it doesn't require a lot of problem solving. But it can also be very high, because it's really difficult. We have to do a lot of problem solving while we're doing this. And or maybe we didn't know enough of that technique or that language. And then the cognitive load becomes very high, and then we don't perform as well as interpreter. So in order to be part of that social process, we also have to improve our cognitive processes, in order to have a manageable cognitive load. And what I look into when I do research is a lot of the cognitive load, what it is, how it works, when it doesn't work. I would say I'm particularly interested, of course, in when it doesn't work. And from a cognitive perspective, we would say that for simultaneous interpreting, we have a simultaneous input and output. It's unidirectional, so only working in one direction. It's what I've been telling you now, right? And unimodal, so only in between spoken languages. Consecutive interpreting is consecutive input, so it comes or rather vice versa, the input comes first, of course, but the output is consecutive. It's also unidirectional and unimodal. In dialogue interpreting, it's largely consecutive input and output, but it's bidirectional, unimodal, because it's spoken language, and the important thing here, which I will come back to as well, is the coordinating role. And in sign language interpreting, it's largely simultaneous input and output, but it's uni and bidirectional, and it's bimodal, so they work in two modes, the oral mode and the sign mode. Yeah, and to add to this, let's see, yeah. So to add to this, also in simultaneous interpreting, we have a concurrent production, which means that we produce at the same time as we hear the things, but we also have a concurrent offload. I talked about that. We don't have to remember what we said. Once it's said, it's gone. It's an extreme time constraint. You know that, right? You know that it's 2 to 4 seconds after the speaker, and this means that you have to understand, produce, and everything in those 2 to 4 seconds. Of course you don't. You understand and plan your production while the other person is speaking, but that is also why it's such an advanced language use. For consecutive interpreting, consecutive input and output, we said that, but it's also a long consecutive production. So you take notes for up to 5 to 7 minutes. So that is really a challenge for your memory, right? But you offload also. You have the notepad, so you can offload on the notepad to support your memory. And there's, of course, less time constraint because you have longer time to understand. If you listen to the speech for 5 to 7 minutes, usually you understand what they are saying. You might not all remember everything, right? But usually you understand it at least. So the challenge might be to reproduce everything afterwards. In dialogue interpreting, we add, so there's a consecutive production utterance by utterance. I talked about that. But there is little or no possibility to offload. So you have to, what you're going to say, you have to remember. Because there's very little notes in dialogue interpreting. You may note down an address or year of birth, but that's it, right? So the rest you have to remember. And there's also a challenging time constraint because you have to produce something in order to keep the dialogue going, right? I also wanted to say that when we've done research in dialogue interpreting for how long they wait before they are sort of indicating to take the turn, it doesn't matter whether you're inexperienced or experienced interpreter. It seems to be something between 6 and 9 seconds. So you actually have the time to say quite a lot in 6 to 9 seconds, but our conclusions from that is that after 6 to 9 seconds, you don't remember anymore. So you have to take the turn in order to be able to interpret what is being said. And for sign language interpreting, you have concurrent production and concurrent offload. The challenges here is the extreme time constraint and the two modalities, of course, simply because it's so different between what you say in the signed mode and in the oral mode. I am now at my slide number 19. The next slide will start talking about monitoring, so I'm thinking that I'm doing this slide and then we have a short break. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay, so there are a lot of skills required. Now I've talked about what we do in the different interpreting modes. But what I haven't really talked about, but I think you have probably already some ideas of the skill requirements for the interpreting process. And as I said again, as a researcher, I'm interested in the process, what happens in the interpreter. And since I'm interested in cognition, I'm mostly interested in what happens in the interpreter, although I also have to look at the others in some cases, because otherwise I don't know. Oops, he was not going to. I must have some time limit on that one, so I'm going to make sure that we stay on this one. where was I? Yeah, so I'm interested in the process, but the process relies on a lot of different skills. There won't be a process if we don't have all these skills. And if we look at the different types of interpreters, we can't say that we need different skills, one from the other. It's quite similar skills. You would say, and this is not me who has invented all these skills, it's everywhere in the literature, and I'm sure you've already talked about it. So we need to be able to listen, and listen in a very particular way, right? The active listening of interpreting. The comprehension, of course, super important. If we don't understand, we can't interpret. We need to, and we also do have a good memory, especially the working memory. I'm going to talk more about the working memory, but the working memory of interpreters that's what we train, and that's what we use in order to be able to do interpreting. Of course, note-taking, more so for spoken language interpreters perhaps than for sign language interpreters, but regardless of what type of interpreters we use note-taking. Public speaking, of course, the production, the ability to transfer. I don't know about you, but we test our students just that they have the ability to transfer between two languages. Because we regularly see students who would like to take our course, but they just can't do it. They are either they freeze or they get everything backwards, or so the ability to transfer between two languages is not whether you are bilingual or not. You may be a very strong bilingual and still not have that immediate possibility to transfer between the two languages. The interaction management, more important perhaps in dialogue interpreting than in other types of interpreting, but you manage the interactions in many different contexts. Even in simultaneous interpreting, I would say that to a certain extent you manage interaction. The turn-taking in dialogue interpreting, and you also have to handle things like face threats. Do you know what that is? That is when you say something, or not you perhaps, but your speaker says something that risks your other client to lose face. So, saying that he does not know something, or he has not understood something, or maybe he doesn't know what he's talking about. All these things are face threatening. And as interpreters, clearly we handle these types of face threats as well in different ways. The attentional capacity management, probably the most important part of interpreting at all, because we handle our attentional capacity all the time between our two languages and our speakers. All of the nonverbal communication, monitoring, which I will come back to, and problem solving, of course. We have the knowledge, the supporting knowledge. I wouldn't say that these are interpreting skills per se, but we couldn't do the interpreting without them, so the language knowledge, of course, and also general and specific background knowledge. Everything we know about a certain situation will help us when we interpret, right? That's why we also have you read so much other things, because the more you know in general, the more you know about interpreting. And the attentional capacity management and the monitoring is also a central part for all types of interpreting. So I'm going to spend a little more time on monitoring, and which has been part of my research interest for the past couple of years. But I'll let you have, shall we say, a 10-minute stretcher? Is that okay? Yeah? So 1:45? Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Any questions so far? We talked in the break about the fact that when you're learning a language, you are often told to try to think in that language and only, be surrounded of that language and suppress the other languages, because that way you will immerse yourself in the new language faster. Unfortunately, when you interpret, that is not a possibility, right? Because we have to be active in all our languages. So that's yet another skill that we're learning, to know when to use and how to suppress and make use of our different languages. But it's also what gives us the cognitive flexibility that we know that interpreters do have so much more than the general population. I'm going to quickly talk about monitoring, because it's a concept that is very dear to me. It's a cognitive act, so something that we do cognitively or consciously maybe as well, where we control the whole interpreting process, and that is perceiving the other language, understanding, comprehension of what we do, production, and also, as I talked about in dialogue interpreting, it's about turn taking and the primary participants. I'm going to go through this really quickly because we've talked about it a lot, but the monitoring it's a crucial sub-process, but it's of course different depending on which interpreting variety you're focusing on, or which interpreting mode you're focusing on. And we've said that in simultaneous and consecutive you can only focus on your own output, but in dialogue you have to focus on the other participants as well. And as part of our research project on the cognitive processes of dialogue interpreters, we have suggested that interpreters' monitoring is a cognitive process then, through which they observe, evaluate, and possibly take actions for repairing or doing other things. And this is related to their own cognitive processing, but also, depending on the event, to the other participants. I have one more concept to talk to you about before I talk about what we have found in our research project, and that's the concept of professional self-concept. Have you heard about that? You can probably guess what it is. So when you go into a profession, you are, as you learn and get experience within that profession, you get more self-confidence in that profession. So your professional self-concept is how you think about yourself. It's something that is not innate or fixed. It's something that we learn by doing our profession and also by looking at others and what others do. It's a complex, organized, and dynamic set of images, cognitions, and learned beliefs and evaluations. And it is what helps us to act as a professional in that situation. So when we talk about an experienced interpreter, it's also an interpreter who has acquired this professional self-concept, which helps us. And why it is important? It is important because the professional self-concept, going maybe now more to the social side of these processes, is what's helping us evaluating the situation we're in and taking actions in our problem solving. So we are cognitively better because we have this experience and the professional self-concept. So this leads us to this not so good model of the interpreting process, where I've put cognitive load everywhere, because that is what we're working with, more or less. The professional self-concept and the monitoring in the middle, because that are two processes that helps us perform as experienced interpreters. And then, of course, what we do, we perceive, we understand, we transfer, we produce, and we coordinate. And the interpreted event at the bottom, because that's the only thing, of all the things I've talked about here, the interpreted event is the only thing I can look at, right? I don't have access to, I can make lots of predictions about what's happening, but the only thing I can look at is the interpreted event. So what started our research project was then that if the skills requirement, we looked at the skills requirement and we looked at all the different interpreting modes, and if the skills requirements are the same for different types of interpreter specializations, then in theory, a very experienced dialogue interpreter working in the public sector would have the same working memory advantage of that which have been shown for simultaneous interpreters, right? And I don't know if you know, but there's overwhelming scientific proof that simultaneous interpreters has a better working memory than the general population. So when you do memory testing for experienced simultaneous interpreters, they perform better than a general population. And there's also, not as overwhelming, but there's also interesting proof that when you start to learn to interpret, you lose gray matter more slowly, and your brain, your brain composition is not the right word, but your brain is changing slightly. So we all lose gray matter because it's a natural part of aging. So everybody does that all the time. You can lose more gray matter if you drink a lot of alcohol. You lose less gray matter if you do a lot of brain exercises. And interpreting students, compared to after a year, compared to translation students, lose gray matter in a slower pace. So here's to having our brain healthy. But anyway, so we wanted to figure out whether dialogue interpreters also have this memory advantage, right? So we did a project. This is the project participants. It's finished now. It is with my research group at Stockholm University. What we were interested in was to look at the central executive functions. And here I'm really into working memory theory. The central executive functions are the functions that steer our working memory in different directions. So whether we are sharing or shifting attention between two tasks, like speaking and listening. If we're resisting to interference, that's we hear one language, but we know that we're not going to speak that language. So we wanted to know if that is different between dialogue interpreters and experienced simultaneous interpreters. And we also wanted to look at strategies of cognitive load and the nature of monitoring, but I'm not going into that. In my project, we looked at French, Polish, and Spanish, and we looked at two groups, so the inexperienced and the experienced groups. Those of you who have any knowledge in in experiments know that this is a very, very small population if you look at only on language level. If we put the languages together, it's a little bit bigger population. Still too small to make any generalizations whatsoever, but not uninteresting results. So we did a lot of tests, which I'm also not going to tell you very much about because then we will be here the rest of the afternoon. But what we did with them is that we assess their language knowledge to know that they had solid language language competence in the languages they used. And they had to do psychometric tests, which is the tests you do when you sit in front of a computer and you do a lot of problem-solving tests. For instance, you look at an arrow and you're supposed to indicate when one arrow is not pointing at the same direction as the other arrows. You get a matrix with different colors, and then you get an empty matrix, and you have to put the different colors where they were. You listen to a set of letters, then you have to solve a math problem, and then you have to repeat which letters you had heard. So that type of experiments. And what we found was that there wasn't any significant difference between the inexperienced and the experienced dialogue interpreters in these tests. And also, we were, to our great sorrow, the experienced dialogue interpreters performed much worse than the experienced simultaneous interpreters. So I did not do the test with the simultaneous interpreters. I took that from previous studies, but I used the same tests. So in theory, they should, if they had the same working memory advantage, they should have performed on the same level. Now you could say that my group was so small, so I can't really say anything about the results. That might be true, but on the other hand, the difference was so big, so I don't think, maybe had it been a little difference, but they really didn't perform as the simultaneous interpreters. We also suggested, as I told you, we said that there were about 6 to 9 seconds before they indicated that they needed to interpret. And this made us suggest that there is a processing span in dialogue interpreting. And what we mean with processing span is that there's a time limit, which is regardless. So maybe this is a universal memory limit. You can't remember, you know, there's a limit to how much you can remember before you have to start producing. And we said that the processing span is the time from when the speaker starts until the interpreter has finished. So the speaker has one utterance, and then the interpreter takes over, and then the interpreter has finished. All of that is a processing span, and that processing span is more or less the same regardless of your experience or difficulty of or anything else. So it sort of suggests that in dialogue interpreting, there is a memory limit for how much you can remember before you have to start producing. So that's what you're working with when you're doing dialogue interpreting, okay? So all this led us to new questions. And this is that if the skills requirement are the same, then we really had to go back and ask ourselves, are the skills requirements the same when it comes to different interpreters' specialization? Because we said on the skills schema that I showed you, I said that this is what we all suppose that we have to know in order to do the interpreting process. But are they really the same, since we couldn't see the same working memory advantage? Or is it so that depending on what you specialize in, you have a different cognitive profile? So if you specialize in dialogue interpreting, maybe your brain changes differently than if you specialize in simultaneous interpreting. So this is what we wanted to figure out, and this is based, and now I come back to what my colleague Laura Babcock has researched a lot about, Laura, that I told you about in the beginning. So we come back to something which is called the bilingual advantage. I don't know if you've heard about it. Anybody heard about the bilingual advantage? No? The bilingual advantage is said to be that if you are bilingual, your working memory is so good that you're also so much better in other tasks. So overall, if you're bilingual, you would be better on a lot of other things. Well, now that I've told you, you can forget it, because people haven't been able to prove that actually. There was a research study in the 90s that showed, sort of indicated that this could be the case, but when replications have been done, we can't see really a difference, a cognitive difference between bilingual and non-bilingual. So the reason why there would be a bilingual advantage is this thing about the language activation, that there are parallel activation. Your two languages, if you're bilingual, are activated, and that makes something with your brain. And also that you must control your languages all the time, because we know that we can't speak, well, you can't speak Spanish or you can't speak Chinese to me. We all know that, so therefore we control the language when we speak to each other. And this means that if you're using this kind of mechanism, it would boost other domains. But it doesn't work, as I said. But then there were researchers who said that bilingualism is not one thing. And now if you remember what I said in the beginning about interpreting is not one thing, now you know where I'm aiming. So the idea of the bilingualism is not one thing, is what was called then the adaptive control hypothesis. So depending on how you use your languages, you control different things. In a single language context, the language used are in separate environments. So this is what we talked about during the break, that if you're trying to learn Spanish, we didn't talk about that in particular, but the idea is that if you try to learn Spanish, the best way to learn Spanish is to suppress all the other languages, to only be in a Spanish-speaking environment, to really focus on Spanish. Everybody knows that Spanish is the only language, and thereby you don't have the other languages activated, okay? A dual language context would be where languages are used separately but in the same context. So this would be a dual, and perfect example of a dual language context, because you would use your other languages when you speak to speakers of that language, but it would be in a constant stream. So it's only when you speak Spanish in between each other, you only use Spanish. Okay, so you don't have to mix them. And then there's code switching, and that is a dense language context. So this means that if I hang out with people who are really, really fluent in the two languages, we would swap between the languages depending on what is the easiest. So I would use the first word that comes to mind, or the word that is most easy to pronounce, or that makes most sense in that context. But that would require people who are really advanced in the two languages, otherwise it's not possible, right? And for working memory, it means that in single language context, we have a goal maintenance to only speak one language, and we control the interference, so we don't let that other language pop up. So that's one type of working memory processes. In the dual language context, we have goal maintenance because we know which language to talk to who. We control the interference. There's a salient cue detection, which means that if we hear one language, we know that that is the language we're going to use. There's no ambiguity there. And we also inhibit the other language, much more so because we know that we can't go up to anybody and speak that language. And we engage and disengage in one task at a time. So engage in task speaking Spanish or engage in task speaking Chinese. In the dense code switching, it's opportunistic planning, meaning we do what's easiest and what's best in that context. Applied to interpreting, this is the same. It's also a bilingual interactional context, and this is what my colleague then, Laura, suggested. There's an interpreter advantage rather than a bilingual advantage, meaning that what we know, that interpreters have better working memory, at least simultaneous interpreter, better task maintenance, and better dual tasking than the general population. So this is what you're looking at while you're taking this training, right? This is what you're going to become. You're going to have better working memory, better task maintenance, and better dual tasking. Anyway, the problem is that this has only been tested on simultaneous interpreters. And as you saw earlier, when I tried to do it on dialogue interpreters, it didn't work. So now we're interested in looking at the memory processes. These are the memory processes that we assume would be involved in interpreting. Short-term memory, of course. I'm going to show the other slide immediately. Short-term memory, of course, because that's the capacity to hold a small amount of information during a short time, which we need when we listen. The working memory, which is the storage and manipulation of a small amount of information for a short time, which is what we need when we're going to switch it into the other language and produce it. Updating, because new information comes all the time, so we can't hold, like if we have one piece of information that we know is true, we don't have to update that all the time. We have to remember it maybe, like somebody give you a telephone number and you have to remember it. We have to repeat it in order to keep it in our working memory until we have stored it. but we don't have to update it because it will not be a new telephone number all the time. It will be the same. Whereas in interpreting, new information all the time. Phonological loop, that is how we respond to what we hear. And the visuospatial sketchpad, maybe more for sign language interpreting, but that is how we remember things that we see in the working memory. We're now talking about the very short period while we had to remember something to solve a task, okay? The working memory, that is what solves our tasks, our problems. If we have a problem, which is then our problem is we have a message in one language that we have to turn into the other language. To solve that, we use our working memory. And that one I'm going to, okay, yep. And now this is a horrible, horrible sketch because this is just where we are right now. You may notice that some of the pluses are a little bit thicker than the other ones. And this is where we think that the different interpreting specializations are going to be different when we test them. So we think that simultaneous interpreters are going to score high on all of these memory processes test, because presumably they work a lot with all of these memory processes. We think that for simultaneous interpreters, the verbal short-term memory, the verbal working memory, and the updating are the strongest ones. And for dialogue interpreting, we think that it's really the verbal working memory that is working when they have to do this monitoring thing. So we don't know this yet. This is a suggestion. This is what I will leave you with. But our next step is to go out and, so we want to map these cognitive processes if it's at all possible. We are working now with that horrible table to try to identify the working memory tests which are most likely to test the salient features of each specialization. Okay, so which working memory test will make a difference between a dialogue interpreter and a simultaneous one, between a sign language interpreter and a dialogue interpreter. And we're hopefully going to collect data. And with that, I'm going to invite you if you have any questions, and otherwise we'll just go and have a coffee. Thank you.
Questions. So thank you so much, Elizabeth. So now you see thinking, yeah. Creo que lo que nos ha mostrado no es mucha información, ¿no? Pero para empezar a reflexionar, ahora que estáis empezando precisamente ahora a ser entrenado, ¿no? Como intérpretes de conferencias, pues es bueno, yo creo que pensar en todo lo que nos ha dicho, ¿no? Para acelerar nuestro proceso. O sea, quiero decir, sabiendo cómo funciona el cerebro o cómo lo vamos a modelar o qué es lo que podemos hacer con él, lógicamente, pues va más rápido. Así es que, bueno, ¿tenéis alguna pregunta así concreta o no concreta? Aprovechad para preguntar. Mañana, de todas formas, creo que vais a tener un taller con Elizabeth y Helios, con lo cual vais a tener la oportunidad probablemente de poner en marcha mucho de lo que seguramente que puede... Mucho de lo que ha dicho, o algo de lo que ha dicho, ¿no? Probablemente comprobarlo, vosotros mismos comprobarlo. También deciros que hay, acaba de publicarse en la revista esta que tenemos, FITISPOS International Journal, si queréis conocer más acerca de lo que ella hace, se acaba de publicar una entrevista que en esta revista, en el número especial de FITISPOS International Journal que acaba de salir, es online, o sea que podéis fácilmente localizarla y ahí está una entrevista para Elizabeth. Y ya por mi parte, ya para terminar, también deciros, creo que os mencioné brevemente en el coloquio Micone que tuvisteis con Josh Goldsmith, que había una oportunidad, tenéis una oportunidad los días, este jueves y viernes, el 7 y 8, no sé, bueno, son no sé qué día, jueves y viernes. Todavía, bueno, Silvia os podrá enviar el contacto porque tenéis que escribiros ahí personalmente, ¿no? Pero hay en la Comisión Europea, es a través de la Dirección General de Traducción, pero ahí sí que hay muchas conferencias, workshops, precisamente, no únicamente para traductores, como podéis pensar, no, sino que ahí también entra todo lo que es el proceso de traducción e interpretación, o sea, y hay nuevas tareas, o sea, o nuevas profesiones que hay y que os pueden interesar. Va dirigidas precisamente a estudiantes, a posgraduados, o gente que acaba como vosotros que en el máster, con lo cual creo que puede ser interesante. Silvia os puede enviar el enlace y os podéis inscribir uno a uno, te inscribiros uno a uno. Y también os interesa mirar en el Knowledge Center of Interpretation, QCI, que seguro que lo habéis visto ya en el módulo online, que depende de la Dirección General de Interpretación, el Knowledge Center of Interpretation. Ahora, meteros ahí, podéis registrar, va también a unirse, va a haber otro módulo, o vamos, va a de alguna forma unir no solamente interpretación, sino también traducción, porque lógicamente hay tareas que confluyen, o sea que podéis hacer no solo interpretación, sino también hay traducción. Entonces, mirad ese Knowledge Center of Translation and Interpreting porque os puede también sugerir muchas más ideas y contactos. Y por mi parte, nada más, agradecer nuevamente a Elizabeth Tiselice que haya tenido la amabilidad de venir aquí y poder hablar y luego, además, poder enseñaros, ¿no?, gran parte de su sabiduría. Gracias, Elizabeth. Gracias de nuevo.
Well, this is just to thank Elizabeth for a wonderful talk. It is always a pleasure to have you around and also to learn from you. And I'm sure that you will all learn from her also tomorrow. Con esta intervención mía, que va a ser muy breve, vamos a dar por inaugurado el máster, aunque ya sabemos que esta inauguración se produce ya avanzado el curso. Yo espero que durante estos meses que nos quedan disfrutéis mucho de vuestras clases presenciales. Llega la presencialidad, eso siempre es una buena noticia. Habéis estado trabajando, ahora vais a trabajar de una manera diferente, ni más ni menos, que nadie se agobie. Va a ser una buena experiencia porque todos los años lo es, entonces este año también lo será. La Universidad de Alcalá pone a vuestra disposición sus instalaciones, todos sus recursos, haced uso de ellos. Vais a estar en las cabinas de interpretación, pero recordad también que tenéis una biblioteca, el CRAI, el Centro de Recursos. Ya las bibliotecas no se llaman bibliotecas casi en ninguna universidad, porque ya más que libros tenemos todo tipo de recursos, sobre todo los recursos electrónicos. Pero haced uso, ¿vale? Porque es conocimiento que tenéis ahí a vuestra disposición, son salas de estudio, espacios agradables para que vosotros disfrutéis y utilicéis. Hacedlo si queréis, de hecho, de una manera egoísta, pensando en el dinero que pagáis por la matrícula. O sea, esto es algo que también a veces tenemos que tener en cuenta. Disfrutad también de Alcalá, algunos ya conocéis la ciudad, es un sitio agradable, hay un muy buen ambiente estudiantil durante todas las horas del día y también de la noche, y ahí está también para vosotros. Y nosotros nos vamos a ver, bueno, me voy a ver con el grupo de inglés. Nos vemos esta tarde, vamos a estar juntos durante esta semana. Y luego, por supuesto, estaremos en contacto. Estáis conociendo en persona a algunos de vuestros profesores ya, seguiréis conociendo a otros tantos. Y como el resto de recursos de la Universidad de Alcalá, nosotros somos recursos humanos y también estamos a vuestra disposición. Y nada más, porque estoy segura de que os apetece disfrutar del café que la organización del máster, la dirección, ha puesto a vuestra disposición. Está en el piso de abajo. Bienvenidos a la Universidad de Alcalá.
Sí, antes de irnos nos vamos a colocar aquí para hacernos una foto de grupo, si os parece bien, y tenemos también un pequeño obsequio para daros.